Berlin, June 5, 1944. Adolf Hitler was in Berchtesgaden when he received an urgent intelligence report that deeply reassured him. The Allied invasion of Normandy that had begun hours earlier was just a distraction. The main attack would come at Calais, exactly where he had positioned his best panzer divisions. The source of this intelligence was an agent Hitler considered the most valuable spy operating within Allied high command, a man whose reports had shaped German strategic decisions for 3 years. A man called Arabelle, whom the British knew by the codename Garbo, a man named Juan Pujol Garcia, who had deceived the Third Reich so completely that even as the Allies consolidated their beachhead in Normandy, Hitler kept his best troops waiting for a phantom invasion that would never come. And the most extraordinary thing about this story is that Juan Pujol began his career as a spy, being rejected by all sides because nobody believed he could be useful. The story begins in 1941, when Juan Pujol was a 29-year-old man with no clear prospects for the future, living in Madrid with his wife Araceli, and a growing conviction that Nazism was an evil that needed to be defeated. Pujol was not a soldier, had no military training, possessed no connections with governments or intelligence services. He had worked as a hotel manager, chicken farmer, and had tried various careers without particular success in any. But there was a war raging across Europe, and Pujol believed with almost religious intensity that he should do something to help defeat Hitler. The problem was that absolutely nobody wanted his help. He first tried offering his services to the British. Pujol walked into the British embassy in Madrid in January 1941 and explained that he wanted to be a spy against the Germans. British officers listened to him politely and dismissed him. He had no useful skills, no access to German circles, nothing that qualified him for intelligence work. He was just an ordinary Spaniard with strong opinions but no practical capabilities. Pujol tried again a few months later with the same result. The British weren't interested in enthusiastic amateurs. They needed professionals, or at least people with access to valuable information. Desperate to contribute in some way, Pujol had an idea that was simultaneously brilliant and completely insane. If the British didn't want him as a spy against the Germans, perhaps the Germans would accept him as a spy against the British. And once he established credibility with the Germans, he could then offer himself to the British again, this time bringing real access to the Nazi intelligence apparatus. It was a risky plan that could easily result in his execution by either side or both, but Pujol was so determined that personal risks seemed secondary. In February 1941, he approached German officers in Madrid, presenting himself as a Spaniard with fascist sympathies and contacts in London who could provide intelligence about the British. Initially, the Germans were as skeptical as the British had been, but Pujol was persistent and convincing, and eventually the Abwehr decided it was worth testing. They gave him basic instructions on how to communicate, provided modest money, and told him to go to London and start sending reports. There was one critical problem with this plan. Pujol had no intention of going to London, had no British visa, and even if he had, traveling through occupied France and crossing the Channel during wartime was nearly impossible for a civilian. So Pujol did something extraordinary. He went to Lisbon, Portugal, which was neutral, and had libraries with British tourist guides, maps, train schedules, and newspapers from London. He installed himself in a modest room and began studying Britain through public sources, learning geography, culture, the transportation system, everything he needed to pretend to be living in London. Then he began sending reports to the Abwehr in Madrid, describing life in the British capital, troop movements he supposedly observed, conversations he overheard in pubs, information he collected through a network of fictional sub-agents he claimed to be recruiting. The first reports were amateurishly bad. He made basic mistakes about British geography, described meetings in places that didn't exist, reported military activities that anyone actually in London would know were impossible. But the Abwehr in Madrid wasn't checking details carefully. They were under pressure from Berlin to produce intelligence about Britain, and Pujol's reports, even though flawed, were better than nothing. They accepted his material and began passing it up the chain of command, where it eventually reached intelligence officers in Berlin. Pujol continued the operation for months, gradually refining his technique, learning from his own mistakes, making the reports more convincing. He created fictional sub-agents, a commercial airline pilot who traveled around Britain, a government ministry employee, a disgruntled military officer. Each character had a personality, motivations, circumstances that explained why they would be passing information. It was an elaborate work of fiction that Pujol built day after day in a hotel room in Lisbon, pretending to be a spy network operating in London. During this time, he continued trying to contact the British. His wife Araceli visited the British embassy in Lisbon several times, explaining that her husband was deceiving the Germans and wanted to work for the Allies. Initially, the British were as skeptical as they had been in Madrid, but eventually an intelligence officer named Desmond Bristow began investigating Araceli's claims. Bristow checked reports that the Abwehr was circulating and recognized some as obviously false, based on geographical and logistical impossibilities. But other reports contained sufficiently plausible details that they were being taken seriously by German intelligence. Bristow realized he had an extraordinary opportunity. If the Germans already believed that this Spanish amateur was a legitimate spy operating in London, the British could bring him under control and transform him into a deception channel. They wouldn't need to establish Pujol's credibility. He had already done that himself through crazy persistence and fertile imagination. The British only needed to refine him, give him real information mixed with carefully calibrated falsehoods, and use the network of fictional agents he had created to feed the Germans strategic disinformation. In April 1942, Juan Pujol and Araceli were secretly transported to England and placed under MI5 control. He was assigned a handler named Thomas Harris, a British intelligence officer who immediately recognized that Pujol possessed genuine talent for deception. Harris began working with Pujol to expand and refine the fictional network of sub-agents. They developed detailed backstories for each character, established communication patterns, created distinct personalities that would make the reports more convincing. The network grew to eventually include 27 fictional sub-agents scattered across Britain and some parts of Europe. There was the pilot, supposedly flying commercial routes that gave him visibility of military activities. The Welshman, an anti-British nationalist leader recruited because he believed Germany would support Welsh independence. The widow, a woman who worked in a ministry office and stole documents for money. Each character had motivations, vulnerabilities, circumstances that explained their access to information. And Pujol, working with Harris, wrote in the voice of each one, creating correspondence that seemed to come from real people with real concerns and perspectives. The Abwehr was completely convinced. The reports they received from Arabelle, as they called Pujol, were more detailed and apparently reliable than any other source they had in Britain. They began paying Pujol substantial amounts, sending money through bank accounts in Lisbon that the British controlled. Each payment was evidence that the Germans completely trusted the operation, and the more they trusted, the more the British could feed them disinformation shaped to influence German strategic decisions. The first real test came in November 1942 with Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. The British wanted to convince the Germans that any Mediterranean operation would target Sardinia or southern France, not the French North African coasts. Pujol sent a series of reports through his fictional network describing troop movements through Gibraltar, suggesting that the buildup was for an operation against Sardinia. He cited a conversation the pilot supposedly overheard, documents the widow photographed, observations other agents made. The reports were so detailed and specific that the Abwehr accepted them as high-quality intelligence and passed them to German high command. When the Allies landed in Morocco and Algeria instead of Sardinia, the Germans assumed that plans had changed at the last moment, not that Arabelle had provided deliberate disinformation. In fact, the explanation that Pujol provided after the invasion, that his sub-agents had reported original plans that were altered for security reasons, was completely accepted. This strengthened his credibility rather than damaging it. During 1943, Pujol continued sending an extraordinary volume of intelligence. He was sometimes producing 3 or 4 long letters per week, each filled with details about British military activities, troop movements, political discussions, economic situation. The vast majority was true or based on truth, information the Germans could verify through other sources. This established absolute trust. But mixed with the truth were falsehoods carefully positioned at crucial moments. disinformation designed to shape German perceptions in ways that would benefit the Allies. Harris and Pujol developed a sophisticated technique of establishing patterns through truthful reports and then breaking patterns at strategic moments with falsehoods. For example, if the pilot normally reported accurate locations of military units based on flight observations, the Germans learned to trust those locations. Then, when it was important to deceive them about force positioning, the pilot would report false locations, and the Germans would believe it because he had established a record of accuracy. The Abwehr was so impressed with Arabelle that in July 1943 they awarded him the Iron Cross, one of the highest German military decorations, for his exceptional services to the Reich. Pujol, sitting in a safe house in London, received the news with a mixture of ironic pride and renewed determination to use the credibility to cause maximum possible damage to the Nazi regime that was honoring him. Pujol's most significant contribution came in preparation for D-Day. Operation Fortitude was a massive deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion of France would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. It involved phantom military units, false radio traffic, inflatable equipment, and crucially a network of double agents including Pujol reporting military activities that supported the Calais narrative. For months before June 1944, Pujol sent detailed reports from his sub-agents describing the buildup of forces in southeastern England, the area from which a Calais invasion would be launched. He reported conversations overheard in pubs, observations of equipment movements, documents seen in ministry offices. Everything pointed to Calais as the target. The reports were so convincing because they contained verifiable real information about units that actually existed, mixed with false information about phantom units that the Germans couldn't easily verify. But the true masterstroke came on June 6, 1944, when the Normandy invasion began. Pujol had elaborated a risky plan with Harris. He would send an urgent message to the Germans at 3 a.m. on D-Day, hours before the first landings, warning that an invasion was imminent. The message would be accurate, but too late for the Germans to do anything useful with the information. But it would demonstrate that Pujol had access to extremely sensitive last-minute intelligence. This would increase his credibility for the crucial messages that would come after. There was a calculated risk here. If the Germans received the warning and managed to respond effectively, it could cost Allied lives. But the timing was carefully planned so that the message would arrive after it would be possible to reposition significant forces. The bigger risk was that the German intelligence officer receiving the message in the middle of the night might not pass it forward immediately. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Pujol sent the message at 3 a.m., but the duty officer in Madrid didn't think it necessary to wake his superiors for intelligence from a spy, even if it was Arabelle. The message was only processed many hours later, too late to affect events in Normandy. When superiors at the Abwehr finally saw the message, they were furious that it hadn't been communicated immediately, but this worked perfectly for Pujol's plan. He sent an indignant message to his handlers in Madrid, complaining that he had risked everything to provide urgent warning and incompetent officers hadn't transmitted it in time. This convincing display of anger made the Abwehr feel guilty for wasting valuable intelligence and made them even more receptive to Pujol's next messages. 3 days after D-Day, with the Allies establishing a beachhead in Normandy, Pujol sent a long, detailed message that would change the course of events. He reported that his agents in southeastern England observed that troops were still concentrated there, that equipment was still being accumulated, that Normandy was clearly a diversion and the main attack would still come at Calais. He presented elaborate evidence, reports from multiple sub-agents, observations from different locations, even a conversation an agent supposedly overheard between drunk American officers in a bar. The message was a masterpiece of deception. It contained enough detail to seem absolutely convincing, touched on German fears that Normandy might be a distraction, and came from a source the Germans had learned to trust completely. Most importantly, it told Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear, that his instincts about Calais were correct, that he should keep panzer divisions there instead of sending them to Normandy. Hitler received Pujol's report and saw confirmation of his own strategic suspicions. He ordered that Army Group B, which included several of the best panzer divisions, remain near Calais waiting for the main invasion. These divisions could have been committed to Normandy in the crucial days after D-Day, when the Allied beachhead was still vulnerable. Instead, they sat idle hundreds of kilometers away, waiting for an attack that would never come. In the following weeks, Pujol continued feeding the deception. He reported that the buildup in southeastern England remained constant, that preparations for a second invasion continued, that Normandy was absorbing Allied attention, but the true objective remained Calais. Each report reinforced the previous message, keeping the Germans paralyzed by indecision. When they finally realized that Normandy was the only main invasion, it was too late. The Allies had consolidated positions, built logistical capacity, made the beachhead virtually impossible to dislodge. Later military estimates suggested that if the panzer divisions kept near Calais had been committed to Normandy in the first 3 days after the invasion, they might have pushed the Allies back into the sea. The decision to keep them waiting for a phantom Calais invasion, a decision heavily influenced by Pujol's reports, was one of the most costly tactical errors the Germans made during the war. And it was an error based on trusting a spy who had been working against them from the beginning. Pujol continued the operation until May 1945, when Germany surrendered. During 3 years, he had sent approximately 315 long letters and 2,000 radio messages, creating a volume of traffic that made the fictional network seem like a massive and highly productive intelligence operation. The Abwehr paid the equivalent of more than $340,000 modern dollars for intelligence that was mostly fabrication. And most importantly, at a crucial moment in the war, he had convinced Hitler to make a decision that helped ensure D-Day's success. After the war, Pujol disappeared. He was concerned that surviving Germans who discovered the truth about Arabelle might seek revenge. He faked his own death from malaria in Angola in 1949, allowing Juan Pujol to officially cease to exist. He moved to Venezuela under a new name, worked in various businesses, lived a quiet and anonymous life. His family believed he was dead. British intelligence officers who had worked with him assumed the same. For decades, Pujol's contribution remained classified. Even when historians began writing about D-Day deception operations, Garbo's identity remained secret. Only in 1984, when a researcher named Nigel West was writing a book about World War II double agents, did the truth emerge. West tracked Pujol to Venezuela and discovered he was still alive, living under an assumed name, working in a small book business. When the story was revealed, the reaction was mixed. Some celebrated Pujol as a hero who had contributed fundamentally to Allied victory. Others questioned the ethics of such elaborate deception, the moral implications of deceiving enemies so completely. Pujol personally was modest about his achievements. He insisted he had simply done what he believed necessary to defeat Nazism, that his talent for invention had found useful purpose in extraordinary circumstances. In 1984, he was invited to London to receive belated honors. It was an emotional meeting with surviving British intelligence officers who had worked with him. He visited the war cenotaph, paid respects to soldiers who had fought in invasions his work helped make successful, and for the first time in decades, he spoke publicly about his experiences, explaining in interviews how a Spanish amateur without training had deceived Europe's most feared intelligence apparatus. Pujol died in Caracas in 1988 at age 76. Obituaries finally told the complete story of a man who had received decorations from both Germany and Britain, the only person known to achieve that distinction. But more importantly, they celebrated the extraordinary contribution of an ordinary civilian who decided he should do something against evil, and through creativity, persistence, and remarkable courage, had an impact on the war that most generals never achieve. The story of Juan Pujol matters not just for the tactical impact on D-Day, though that alone would be enough to guarantee his place in history. It matters because it demonstrates how individual determination can shape events on a scale impossible to predict. Pujol was not a soldier, was not a trained spy, had no connections or resources. He was just a man with strong moral conviction and willingness to risk everything to act on that conviction. He proved that deception warfare requires not just massive institutional resources, but imagination, obsessive attention to detail, and deep understanding of human psychology. Pujol understood that the Germans wanted to believe certain things about the Allies, that they had prejudices that could be exploited, that confirmation of existing beliefs was more easily accepted than information contradicting expectations. He used this understanding to build a narrative that the Nazis believed completely because it aligned with what they already thought was true. The operation also demonstrates the extraordinary risks of relying too heavily on a single source, no matter how reliable it seems. The Germans had verified Pujol's reports repeatedly during 3 years. They had tested his information against other sources, confirmed details, established that he had real access to high-quality British intelligence. But all of this was carefully constructed to establish credibility that would be exploited at the most crucial moment. When it finally mattered, when the decision about Calais versus Normandy had to be made, the Germans trusted Arabelle because he had proven trustworthy hundreds of times before. They didn't realize that all that trustworthiness was preparation for the final deception. Hitler believed Juan Pujol until it was too late because Pujol had dedicated years making himself believable. Each truthful report was an investment in credibility that would be spent at the decisive moment. And when that moment came, in June 1944, when German panzer divisions needed to be in Normandy, but remained waiting at Calais, Juan Pujol collected the return on 3 years of patient and meticulous deception. He had deceived Hitler so completely that even when evidence contradicted Arabelle's reports, the Führer chose to believe the spy instead of his own eyes. And that belief cost Germany perhaps its last real chance to repel the Allied invasion of Europe.